I speak 9 languages, the waitress said softly, her voice steady enough to cut through the low hum of crystal glasses and quiet jazz, and for a moment, the entire table fell into a silence so thin it almost felt like it might shatter. Then the laughter came. Not loud at first, just a few amused exhales from men in tailored suits, but it spread quickly, rippling across the table like a private joke everyone suddenly understood except her. Richard Whitmore leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth as he studied her like she was a curiosity rather than a person. The restaurant glowed in warm gold light, chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors, the skyline of Manhattan stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a promise only a few people in the room could afford to keep. And yet, standing there in a simple black uniform, a notepad tucked against her palm, Amora Collins didn't shrink. She didn't apologize. She didn't laugh along. She just stood still, her shoulders relaxed, her chin slightly lifted, as if she had said something ordinary, something true. 9 languages, one of the guests repeated, raising an eyebrow. That's impressive, another added, though his tone suggested the opposite. Richard chuckled then, a low, controlled sound that carried more weight than the others. Go on, he said, gesturing lightly with his glass. Tell me, which 9? His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that closed deals and dismissed people in the same breath. Around him, the table leaned in, not out of curiosity, but anticipation, the quiet thrill of watching someone be proven wrong. Amora's fingers tightened just slightly around the edge of her notepad, a small movement almost invisible under the dim lighting, but her eyes remained calm. There was something in them, something older than the room, older than the polished silverware and the $1,000 suits, that didn't belong to this place. Spanish, French, Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, she began, her tone even, unhurried, as if listing them wasn't a performance but a memory. A few of the guests exchanged glances. The laughter softened, just a fraction. Richard tilted his head, watching her more closely now, though the amusement hadn't left his expression. And the other 4, he asked. Amora met his gaze then, directly, without hesitation. Swahili, Portuguese, German, and 1 more, she said, pausing just long enough for the silence to return, heavier this time, pressing gently against the edges of the table. Somewhere behind her, a glass clinked. A server moved past, unnoticed. The city outside continued breathing, unaware of the small shift unfolding inside. Richard smirked, setting his glass down with a soft tap against the table. Convenient pause, he said. Let me guess, the last one is something no one here understands. A few chuckles followed, lighter now, but still there. Still enough. Amora didn't look away. If anything, her expression softened, not with embarrassment, but with something quieter, something almost reflective. No, she said gently. It's something someone here forgot. The words didn't land like a challenge. They landed like a memory. And for the first time that night, the smile on Richard Whitmore's face didn't quite hold. The air did not return to normal after her words, it shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a room where the temperature drops without anyone touching the thermostat, and Richard felt it before he understood it, a faint tightening in his chest that he dismissed almost instantly as irritation rather than anything deeper, because men like him did not get unsettled by waitresses with calm eyes and quiet voices, they controlled the room. They defined it, and so he leaned forward again, resting his elbows lightly on the edge of the table, reclaiming the space with a practiced ease that had taken decades to perfect. Forgot, he repeated, his tone smooth but edged now, not amused anymore, not entirely. That is an interesting choice of words, and a few of the guests shifted in their seats, sensing the change, the way a conversation could tilt from entertainment into something sharper, something personal, but no one interrupted. Because no one ever interrupted Richard Whitmore when his attention locked onto something, or someone, like that, and Amora did not move, she did not retreat, she simply stood there, her posture still composed, her breathing steady, as if the weight of the room pressing against her did not exist, or perhaps as if she had stood in heavier rooms before and learned how to remain standing anyway. Yes, she said quietly, forgot, and there was no accusation in her voice, no challenge. Just a simple statement that somehow made the silence feel louder than any argument could have. Richard let out a short breath through his nose, almost a laugh but not quite, and reached for his glass again. Though he did not drink, he just held it, turning it slightly in his hand as if the motion helped him think, or perhaps helped him stay in control. "All right," he said after a moment, his voice lifting just enough for the table to relax again, or think they could. "Let us make this simple." And there it was, the shift into something he understood completely. A negotiation, a test, a game with rules he could define. "You say you speak 9 languages, he continued, glancing briefly at the others before returning his gaze to her. "Then prove it." A few smiles returned, cautious at first, but present, because now this was familiar territory again. A performance, a challenge, something measurable, something that could end cleanly, with a winner and a loser. "Right here," he added, tapping the table lightly with one finger. "No stories, no poetry. Just results." Amora's eyes flickered for the briefest second, not away from him, but inward, as if she were searching for something within herself rather than reacting to him, and then she nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "Okay," she said, and the simplicity of that answer landed differently than expected, because she did not hesitate, she did not argue, she did not try to explain herself further, she accepted. And something about that acceptance made a few people at the table sit up a little straighter, though they could not quite say why. "Good," Richard replied, leaning back again, satisfaction returning to his expression. "Let us start easy." He gestured toward a man seated 2 chairs down, a client from Paris who had been quietly observing until now. "Jean, would you mind?" The man smiled politely, turning toward Amora, switching seamlessly into French as he spoke, his tone conversational but deliberate, testing, and without missing a beat, Amora responded, her accent precise, her cadence natural, not rehearsed, not exaggerated, but lived in, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, not explosive, but undeniable. Like a light turning on in a room no one realized had been dim. Jean blinked, then smiled again. This time differently, this time with recognition rather than politeness, and a murmur passed through the table, soft but present. Richard's fingers stilled against his glass, just for a second, just long enough for something unfamiliar to pass across his face before he caught it, before he replaced it with composure. But the room had already felt it, that small fracture in certainty, that first quiet crack in the idea that this was going to be simple. The murmur did not fade this time, it spread, low and uncertain, as if the room itself was trying to decide what it had just witnessed, and Richard felt it again, sharper now, that subtle shift slipping further out of his control, but he did not let it show. He could not here, not in front of people who had built their perception of him on certainty and dominance, so he straightened slightly, his voice returning with a measured calm that had closed billion-dollar negotiations and ended countless conversations exactly where he wanted them to end. "Beginner's luck," he said lightly, though the words landed thinner than intended, and a few at the table laughed, but the laughter did not carry the same confidence as before, not after hearing the way Amora had spoken, not after seeing the way Jean had responded, and Richard noticed that too, every detail, every shift in posture, every glance that lingered just a second too long on her instead of him, and that was something he could not allow to continue. "Let us raise the stakes," he added, his tone sharpening just enough to reclaim attention, and he turned his gaze to a woman seated across from him, a business partner from Tokyo who had remained quiet until now, observing with composed interest. "Yuki," he said, "would you mind?" The woman inclined her head slightly, then looked at Amora and began to speak in Japanese, her words flowing quickly, naturally, not simplified, not adjusted, and for a fraction of a second, the room held its breath again, waiting, watching, expecting perhaps a hesitation this time, a stumble, something that would restore the balance they understood, but it did not come. Amora answered almost immediately, her voice soft but clear, matching the rhythm and tone with a precision that felt effortless, and there was something else in it now, something deeper than skill, something like familiarity, like she was not translating but remembering, and Yuki's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, her polite interest giving way to genuine surprise. "Your accent," she said in English after a moment, "it is not learned from books," and Amora gave a small nod. "No," she replied. "It is not," and that was all, no explanation, no elaboration, just another piece placed quietly on the table, and the room reacted again, this time with less noise but more weight, because the pattern was forming now, undeniable, and Richard could feel it pressing in, the realization that this was no longer a novelty, no longer something easily dismissed, and yet he pushed forward, because stopping now would mean conceding something he had not yet defined. Arabic, he said, almost immediately, turning to a man at the far end of the table. His voice quicker now, less casual. You are fluent, are you not? The man nodded, intrigued, and began speaking, his tone more deliberate, more challenging, and again, Amora followed, her response fluid, precise, the sounds rolling naturally from her tongue as if they had always belonged there, and this time there was no laughter at all, no whispered commentary, only silence and the quiet clink of a glass being set down somewhere in the room, unnoticed, irrelevant compared to what was unfolding, and Richard felt something shift inside him, not just irritation now, but something closer to disbelief, something that did not fit neatly into the categories he preferred, and he leaned forward again, studying her more closely, really looking now, not at the uniform or the setting, but at her, at the steadiness in her posture, the calm in her eyes, the absence of performance in everything she did, and for the first time that evening, he did not speak immediately, he hesitated, just for a second, and in that second, the balance of the room tilted a little further away from him. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was aware, like a room that had just realized it had been watching the wrong person all along, and Richard felt it settle into the space between every breath, every glance, every subtle shift of attention that no longer belonged entirely to him, and for a man who had spent his life commanding rooms without effort, that realization did not sit quietly, it pressed, it demanded response. And so he moved again, this time slower, more deliberate, setting his glass down fully as if anchoring himself back into control. Interesting, he said, his voice lower now, less performative, but still firm, still carrying the weight of someone used to being the final word in any exchange. Very interesting, he repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Amora, not dismissing her anymore, not exactly, but searching for the edge, the flaw, the place where this could still turn back into something manageable, something he understood, because everything had a limit, everything had a point where it could be explained, reduced, categorized, and he intended to find it. You have prepared well, he continued, the faintest hint of a smile returning, though it did not reach his eyes this time, but preparation is not the same as truth, and a few at the table shifted again, relieved perhaps to hear a familiar tone, something that sounded like control reasserting itself. Even if only partially, let us try something less rehearsed, he added, leaning slightly forward, his gaze steady now, focused entirely on her. German, he said, turning his head briefly toward a man seated near the end of the table, an older executive who had remained quiet throughout, observing with a careful, measured expression. You grew up in Munich, did you not? The man nodded once, then turned to Amora, speaking in German with a tone that was not conversational anymore but precise, layered, filled with idioms and phrasing that would challenge anyone who had only studied the language in fragments, and for the first time, there was a pause, not long, not dramatic, but enough to be noticed, enough for a few shoulders around the table to relax slightly, as if expecting the moment they had been waiting for, the crack, the slip, the confirmation that this had all been impressive but limited, and Richard saw it too, he felt it, that brief opening where the narrative could still be reclaimed. But then Amora spoke, and the pause did not become a mistake, it became something else entirely, something intentional, as if she had chosen her words with care rather than searched for them, her response unfolding in German with a depth that did not just match the question but expanded it, adding nuance, context, a tone that felt lived in rather than learned, and the older man's expression shifted slowly, his eyes narrowing not in doubt but in recognition. That is, he began, then stopped, switching back to English as if needing to anchor himself. That is how my grandmother used to speak, and the words hung there, heavier than anything that had been said so far, because they carried something beyond language, something personal, something that could not be easily replicated or faked, and the room felt it. The difference between skill and memory, between repetition and understanding, and Richard leaned back slightly, his fingers pressing together now, no longer relaxed, no longer casual, his mind moving faster than his expression allowed, recalibrating, reassessing, trying to find the angle that still gave him ground. Coincidences happen, he said after a moment, though the certainty in his voice had thinned, just enough to be heard by those paying attention, and this time, more of them were. Languages can be imitated, he added, almost as if reminding himself as much as anyone else, and Amora watched him, not with defiance, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet patience that felt out of place in a moment like this, as if she had already moved past the need to prove anything at all, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because it meant the game he had set in motion was no longer being played on his terms, and for the first time since the evening began, Richard Whitmore did not know what the next move should be. The room did not feel like a stage anymore. It felt like a place where something real was unfolding, something no one had planned for, and Richard could sense it slipping further beyond the boundaries he had set, beyond the neat structure of a test he could win, and that realization did not sit quietly inside him, it pressed against his composure, testing it in ways he had not experienced in years, because control had always come easily to him. It was the language he spoke best, and now, for the first time in a long while, he was no longer fluent. He exhaled slowly, then leaned forward again, not with the same casual confidence as before, but with intention, with focus sharpened by something deeper than pride. "You are good," he said, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier amusement. "I will give you that," and the words landed differently, not as praise, but as acknowledgement, the kind that carried weight because it was rarely given. And the table felt it, the shift from dismissal to recognition, subtle but undeniable. "But being good at languages," he continued, his gaze fixed on her, "is not the same as understanding people," and there it was, a new angle, a different kind of challenge, one that moved beyond vocabulary and into something less measurable, something he believed he still held the advantage in, because understanding people was how he had built everything he owned, every deal, every decision, every calculated risk, and he was not ready to surrender that ground. "Not yet. Let me ask you something," he added, his tone quieter now, drawing the attention of everyone at the table without raising his voice. "Why those languages?" And for the first time since the exchange began, the question did not feel like a trap, it felt like a search, like he was trying to find the pattern behind her answers, the logic that would explain her, reduce her to something he could categorize, something that made sense in his world. And Amora did not answer immediately, not because she hesitated, but because she seemed to consider the question fully, as if it deserved more than a quick response, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of her notepad, her posture unchanged, steady, grounded, "Because they were given to me," she said at last, her voice soft but clear, and a few brows at the table furrowed. The answer unexpected, not fitting into the structure they had anticipated. "Given to you," Richard repeated, his tone narrowing slightly, and she nodded once. "Each one came from someone," she continued, "someone who needed to be understood," and the words did not rise, they did not push, they simply settled into the space, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but profound, because it shifted the entire frame of what they had been witnessing, from performance to purpose, from skill to story, and Richard felt it. That shift, more than anyone, because it moved the conversation into territory he could not easily control, not with logic, not with strategy, not with the tools he had relied on his entire life, and yet he pressed on, because stopping would mean accepting something he had not yet fully grasped. "That sounds poetic," he said, though there was less dismissal in his voice now, more caution, "but poetry does not hold up under pressure," and he gestured lightly again, scanning the table as if searching for one more test, one more chance to re-establish the balance. "Russian," he said finally, his tone firm again, turning to a man who had been silent until now, a client known for his directness, his lack of patience for anything he considered superficial. "Speak with her," and the man did, his words quick, layered, filled with subtle meaning that demanded more than translation, and once again, Amora answered, not just correctly, but completely, her tone matching his, her response carrying the same weight, the same rhythm, and when she finished, the man gave a single nod, nothing more, but in a room like this, that nod carried more validation than applause ever could, and Richard sat back slowly, his hands now resting still against the table, no longer moving, no longer searching for something to hold on to, because the pattern was no longer forming, it had formed, and it was something he could not easily dismantle, and for the first time that night, the question was no longer whether she could prove herself, it was whether he could accept what had already been proven. The nod from the Russian client did not echo, it settled, heavy and final, like a door closing on any doubt that had once lived in the room, and for a long moment no one spoke, not because they did not know what to say, but because anything said too quickly would feel smaller than what had just happened, and Richard sat there, still, his hands resting against the table, his fingers no longer tapping, no longer moving, as if motion itself might break something fragile that had formed in the space between him and the woman standing across from him, and for the first time that evening, he was not thinking about how to win, he was thinking about how he had misread the entire situation from the beginning, and that realization did not come as a single thought, it came in layers, quiet and persistent, reshaping everything that had led to this moment, the laughter, the challenge, the certainty, all of it now standing in contrast to what was undeniably real in front of him, and yet, even as that awareness grew, there was still one question left, one thread he had not yet pulled, not because it would prove her wrong, but because he needed to understand, truly understand, what stood before him, and so he leaned forward again, slower this time, not to assert control, but to close the distance between assumption and truth. "You said they were given to you," he said, his voice lower now, almost careful, as if choosing each word mattered more than before, and the room listened differently this time, not with anticipation, but with attention, genuine and unguarded. "Who gave them to you?" And the question did not feel like a test anymore, it felt like an opening, a door that had not been there earlier, and Amora's eyes softened just slightly, not with relief, but with recognition, as if she had been waiting for that question without needing to ask for it, and she drew a small breath, steady and quiet, before answering. "People who were not heard," she said, and the words carried something that did not need explanation, something that moved through the room without force but with depth, and Richard held her gaze, not interrupting, not redirecting, allowing the space to remain open, and she continued. "When I was younger, my mother worked in places like this," she said, her voice still even, still controlled, but now layered with something more personal, something that did not seek sympathy but did not hide either. "She cleaned tables, washed dishes, did whatever was needed, and I would sit in the corner with my books, listening, and a few people at the table shifted, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition, as if they were beginning to see the outlines of something they had not noticed before. I listened to conversations no one thought I understood," she added, "and sometimes, someone would speak to me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to be understood," and the room grew quieter still, the kind of quiet that does not come from silence, but from attention, from people leaning in without realizing they are doing it. "A woman from Brazil who missed her family," she said softly, "a man from Morocco who had not spoken his own language in years, a chef from Paris who said food only matters if someone understands what it means," and as she spoke, the languages were no longer abstract, they were not skills to be tested or displayed, they were tied to faces, to moments, to human connections that could not be measured in the way Richard had tried to measure them. "They did not give me words," she said, her gaze steady, "they gave me themselves," and the sentence did not rise, it settled, like everything else she had said, but its weight was undeniable, and Richard felt it, not as a challenge, not as a contradiction, but as something that reached into a part of him he had not accessed in a long time, something quieter than ambition, something deeper than strategy, and for a moment, he did not speak, he did not move, he simply sat there, absorbing what had been said, and the room followed his lead, no one interrupting, no one filling the space, because the need to prove anything had dissolved, replaced by something far more significant, and when he finally did speak, his voice was different, stripped of performance, stripped of defense, and the last one, he asked, not because he doubted her, but because he needed to understand the one thing she had not yet named, the one piece she had held back from the beginning, and Amora looked at him, really looked at him this time, not as a customer, not as a challenge, but as someone standing on the edge of a truth he had not expected to face, and for a brief moment, the city lights behind her reflected in her eyes, steady and bright, before she answered. "That one," she said gently, "was yours." For a moment, no one in the room understood what she meant, not fully, not yet, because the words themselves were simple, but the weight behind them had not reached them all at once. It moved slowly, like a memory surfacing after years of being buried, and Richard felt it first, not as clarity, but as a disturbance, a quiet disruption in the way he understood the world, his world. The one built on precision and control and knowing exactly where every variable stood, and now there was something he did not recognize, something that did not fit into any category he had created. "Mine," he repeated, his voice lower than before, not sharp, not dismissive, but uncertain in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him, and Amora did not step back, she did not fill the silence too quickly, she let it sit, let it breathe, as if she understood that some truths needed space to be heard properly. "Yes," she said gently, and there was no accusation in it, no attempt to confront, only a quiet certainty that did not need to be proven anymore, and the room leaned in again, not out of curiosity now, but because something deeper was unfolding, something that had moved beyond performance entirely. "You used to come here," she continued, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving his, "not this exact room, not this exact table, but this place, years ago, before it was renovated, before the glass walls and the new lighting, and Richard blinked, just once, a small movement, but enough, because the past she was describing was not one he visited often, not one he allowed himself to linger in. It was a version of his life that existed before everything became structured, before everything became measured and optimized and controlled. You would sit near the window, she said, back when the chairs were darker, heavier, and the floor did not reflect the lights the way it does now, and a faint crease formed between his brows, not in doubt, but in recognition, because those details were not public, not obvious. They belonged to a time before the restaurant had become what it was now, before it had become a place people like him used to be seen. You did not talk much, she added, but when you did, it was always on the phone, always about work, always about numbers, timelines, expectations, and a few people at the table exchanged glances. Because that version of Richard still existed, just refined, elevated, expanded, but the core was the same, and Amora's voice softened slightly, not in weakness, but in memory. There was one night, she said, you stayed longer than usual, and something in her tone shifted, just enough to signal that this was not just another observation, this was something that mattered, something that had stayed with her. You were not on the phone, she continued, you were quiet, just sitting there, looking at nothing in particular, and then, you spoke, and Richard's hand moved slightly against the table, a subtle reflex, as if his body had recognized the moment before his mind fully caught up. Not in English, she said, not in anything your clients would understand, and now the room was completely still, the kind of stillness that does not come from expectation, but from realization, because something was about to connect, something that would not be undone. You spoke in a language I had never heard before, she said, soft, almost like you were speaking to someone who was not there, and Richard's breath caught, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for him to feel it, enough for him to know that whatever came next would not be something he could dismiss or control or redirect. I asked my mother what language it was, Amora continued, her voice steady, grounded, and she told me it sounded like something older, something personal, something people do not use unless it matters, and she paused then, just for a moment, not to build tension, but because the memory itself seemed to deserve that pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but clearer than ever. I listened, she said, and I learned, and the words settled into the room like the final piece of something that had been forming since the beginning, and Richard Whitmore sat there, completely still, because he knew, before she even said another word, exactly what language she was talking about, and more importantly, exactly who he had been speaking to that night. The memory did not arrive all at once. It unfolded inside Richard slowly, like a door he had closed years ago now opening without warning, and for the first time that evening, the room around him faded into something distant, something secondary, because the past he had just spoken into existence was no longer a story, it was real, it was his, and he could see it now, the older version of the restaurant, the dimmer lights, the heavier chairs, the quiet corner by the window where he used to sit. When the weight of everything he was building felt heavier than usual, and more than that, he could hear it, the sound of his own voice from that night, softer than anyone in this room had ever heard it, speaking words he had not spoken in years, words that did not belong to business or strategy or control, but to something far more personal, something he had buried beneath success and routine. And his fingers pressed lightly against the table as if grounding himself in the present, though his mind was no longer fully there. You should not know that, he said finally, his voice quieter than it had ever been throughout the evening, not defensive, not dismissive, but almost careful, as if speaking too loudly might break something fragile that had resurfaced, and Amora did not interrupt him, she did not move, she simply stood there, steady, allowing him the space he needed to reach the truth on his own, because this moment was no longer about proving anything, it was about recognition, and recognition cannot be rushed. No one knew that language, he continued, more to himself than to her, not here, not in my world, and a few at the table exchanged confused glances, because the conversation had shifted beyond them now, beyond what they could follow, but no one spoke, no one dared to interrupt, because something in Richard's tone made it clear that this was no longer a performance, this was something real, and Amora's voice came softly, not correcting him, not challenging him, just guiding. It was not meant for them to know, she said, it was meant for someone you missed, and the words landed gently, but they carried weight, and Richard closed his eyes for just a second, not long enough for it to be obvious, but long enough for the memory to settle fully into place, because he knew exactly who she meant. He knew exactly who he had been speaking to that night. and more importantly, he knew why he had never spoken that language again after that, because it had belonged to someone he had lost, someone whose absence had shaped more of his life than he ever admitted, even to himself. And when he opened his eyes again, the room returned, but it felt different now, smaller in some ways, quieter in others, as if everything that had mattered before had shifted slightly out of alignment. And he looked at Amora, really looked at her, not as a waitress, not as a challenge, but as someone who had just carried a piece of his past into the present and placed it gently in front of him. "Say it," he said, and the words were not a command, they were a request, quiet and direct, and the room held its breath again, not out of curiosity this time, but out of respect for something they could feel but not fully understand. And Amora did not hesitate, she did not look around, she did not prepare, she simply spoke, and when she did, the sound of that language moved through the room like something out of time, unfamiliar to most, but unmistakably real, each word soft, measured, carrying a tone that was not learned from repetition but from listening, from holding onto something long enough for it to become part of you. And Richard's expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that could not be hidden either, because recognition does not ask permission before it shows itself, it simply arrives. And in that moment, the distance between who he was and who he had been collapsed into something singular, something present. And when she finished, she did not add anything, she did not explain, she did not look for approval, she simply let the words exist in the space between them. And Richard Whitmore, a man who had built his life on certainty, on control, on knowing exactly what came next, sat there without a single prepared response, because the one thing he had been missing all these years had just been spoken back to him by someone he had once overlooked completely. No one moved after the last word left her lips, not because they were waiting for something more, but because what had already been said was enough, more than enough. And Richard remained still, his gaze fixed on her, yet not entirely seeing her in that moment, because part of him was somewhere else, somewhere years behind, sitting by a window in a quieter version of this same room, speaking softly into the empty space across from him, believing no one was listening, believing those words belonged only to him and to the memory of the person he had lost. And now those same words had returned, not as an echo, not as a fading thought, but as something alive, carried by someone he had once dismissed without a second glance. And that realization did not strike him all at once, it unfolded slowly, pressing against everything he thought he understood about control, about status, about the invisible lines he had drawn between people. And for a moment, he closed his eyes again, longer. This time, not to escape, but to steady himself. And when he opened them, the room came back into focus, but it was not the same room anymore, not to him. The table, the guests, the polished glasses, all of it felt smaller compared to what had just shifted inside him, and he let out a quiet breath, one that carried something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, something unguarded, something real. And then, slowly, he stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough for the movement to be noticed, and the room followed, every eye on him now, not with expectation of dominance, but with uncertainty, because they did not know what version of him would speak next. And Richard looked at Amora, directly, without distance, without the barrier he had held between them from the start. "I was wrong," he said, and the words were simple, but in a room like this, from a man like him, they carried more weight than any speech he had ever given. And no one laughed, no one shifted, because they understood, instinctively, that this was not performance, this was truth. And he continued, his voice steady, but quieter than before, stripped of the authority he once used as armor. "Not just about the languages," he added, "but about you." And Amora did not react immediately, she did not step forward, she did not soften, she simply listened, the same way she had listened to every language that had been given to her. And Richard glanced briefly at the table, at the people who had laughed with him, who had followed his lead without question, and for a moment, something like recognition passed through his expression, recognition of how easily power can shape perception, how quickly a room can decide who matters and who does not. And then he looked back at her. "You were never trying to prove anything," he said, almost as if he was saying it to himself as much as to her. "You were just telling the truth." And the sentence settled into the space between them, quiet but complete. And for the first time that evening, the tension that had filled the room began to dissolve, not because the moment was over, but because it had reached something deeper than resolution, something closer to understanding. And Richard reached into his jacket pocket, then paused, his hand still for a second before he lowered it again, as if realizing that whatever came next could not be solved with money, could not be reduced to a transaction. and that realization, more than anything, marked the shift in him, because it meant he was finally seeing her as she was, not as a role, not as a function, but as a person, and he gave a small nod, not formal, not performative, just genuine. "Thank you," he said, and the words were not about the service, not about the languages, but about what she had returned to him, something he had not known he had lost. And Amora met his gaze, her expression unchanged, steady, grounded, and after a moment, she gave a small nod back, not as acceptance of his apology, but as acknowledgement of the truth that had finally surfaced. And then, quietly, without drawing attention to herself, she stepped back, returning to her place in the room, not smaller, not diminished, but exactly as she had always been, and the room, now fully aware, watched her differently, because once truth is revealed, it does not disappear, it reshapes everything that comes after. And Richard Whitmore, standing there in the center of it all, understood that the most valuable thing he had encountered that night was not something he could acquire, but something he had almost overlooked entirely.